Welcome to the Horror Hive channel, where the darkness and unknown come alive. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an episode of terror. Let's dive into the darkness together. Home Sweet Home, Tale of Isolation. Jane had always loved the feeling of being alone in her home. She loved the quiet, the solitude, and the way the shadows seemed to dance in the corners of her eyes. But tonight, something was different. As she sat in her living room, surrounded by the familiar furnishings, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her imagination, but the sensation only grew stronger. As she made her way to the kitchen to fix herself a cup of tea, she heard a noise coming from upstairs. It was a soft creaking, like someone was walking around in the attic. But that was impossible, she was alone in the house. Wasn't she? Jane tried to shake off her unease, but it was no use. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing on end as she made her way upstairs to investigate. As she reached the top of the stairs, the creaking grew louder, coming from the bedroom at the end of the hallway. She hesitated, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. She turned it slowly and pushed open the door. The room was empty. But as she turned to leave, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A figure standing in the doorway, watching her. It was a man, dressed in clothes that looked like they were from another time. He had a wild look in his eyes and a smile that chilled her to the bone. Jane tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt paralyzed and trapped in the house with a madman. She couldn't move, couldn't look away from those eyes that seemed to see right through her. And then, he was gone, as quickly as he had appeared. Jane never spoke of that night again, but she never forgot it either. Every time she was alone in her home, she could feel those eyes watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down so he could come for her again. As Jane's fear grew, so did the occurrences in her home. She would find objects moved from their original places, or missing altogether. She would wake up to find her clothes rumpled, as if someone had been handling them in her sleep. She would hear strange whispering voices, coming from different parts of the house, but when she would investigate, there would be no one there. One night, she woke up to the sound of someone walking in her room. She could see shadows moving on the walls. She tried to move, to call for help, but her body wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed with fear. And then she felt a hand on her shoulder and she screamed, but no sound came out of her mouth. She also started to see visions of the man everywhere she looked, in the shadows, in her dreams, and even on her reflections. She would see him standing behind her in the mirror, his eyes cold and empty. She would see him in the darkness, waiting for her, always waiting. She tried to leave the house, but every time she would try to go out, something would happen to make her stay. The door would be locked, the keys would be missing, or the car wouldn't start. It was as if the house was keeping her trapped, using the man as its tool to keep her trapped forever. Jane's mind and body started to deteriorate. The constant fear and isolation took a toll on her. She became paranoid, delusional, and her hair turned white from the stress. She was trapped in her own home, with no way out and no one to turn to for help. The house had become her tomb, and the man her tormentor. Until one day, Jane was found dead in her bed, her body cold and lifeless, and a note on her nightstand that read, "He's coming for me." The note was written in a handwriting that was not hers, but it was unmistakably the handwriting of the man who had haunted her for so long. The police never found any clues or evidence as to who the man might be, and the case was never solved. But some say that the house is still haunted to this day, and that if you listen closely, you can still hear Jane's screams, and the whispers of the man who trapped her in her own home. The Haunting of the Old Homestead. It was a beautiful summer day when the Smith family moved into the old homestead on the edge of town. The house had been in the family for generations, and the parents, Emily and Jack, had always dreamed of restoring it to its former glory. They had big plans for the place and were excited to start a new chapter in their lives. But their excitement was short-lived. As soon as they set foot in the house, strange things started to happen. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and they would hear strange noises coming from the basement. At first, they tried to brush it off as their imagination, but the occurrences became more frequent and intense. One night, Emily woke up to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She screamed, but the figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring at her with empty eyes. She tried to wake her husband, but he wouldn't stir. She was trapped, alone in the house with the figure. As the days went by, the family started to notice that the house seemed to have a life of its own. The furniture would rearrange itself, and the paintings on the wall would change. They would hear whispers in the night, coming from the walls and the floors. They became convinced that the house was haunted by a malevolent force. Things came to a head when the youngest child, Timmy, went missing. The parents searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. They called the police, but they found nothing. It was as if the child had vanished into thin air. It was only when the family was packing to leave the house that they discovered Timmy's body, hidden behind a false wall in the basement. He had been dead for days, and his body had been mutilated. The family was never found out what happened to Timmy, but they knew that the house was responsible. The old homestead was abandoned for many years, and no one dared to enter it. But it is said that on quiet nights, when the moon is full, you can still hear Timmy's screams coming from the house, and see the ghostly figure of a child wandering the halls. The house still stands to this day, a silent monument to the horrors that occurred within its walls. The unspeakable horror of the eldritch abode. When John inherited the old mansion on the outskirts of town, he thought it was a stroke of good fortune. The grand estate had been in his family for generations, but had been uninhabited for decades. But as he began to explore the house, he began to notice strange occurrences. Shadows seemed to move on the walls, and he could hear whispers coming from the corners of the rooms. He shrugged it off as his imagination, but the strangeness persisted. As he delved deeper into the house, he discovered a hidden room in the basement. Inside, he found an ancient tome bound in human skin and filled with unspeakable knowledge. He couldn't resist the urge to read it, and as he did, he began to uncover the dark secrets of the house and its previous occupants. The more he read, the more he became convinced that the house was inhabited by an ancient and malevolent force. It seemed to be aware of his presence, and was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He started to feel as if he was being followed, and he was never alone. John became increasingly paranoid and isolated, unable to leave the house or bring anyone else inside. The force seemed to be feeding off of his fear and growing stronger. He began to have nightmares, filled with grotesque creatures and unspeakable horrors. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt a presence in the room. He opened his eyes to see a monstrous being, unlike anything he had ever seen before, standing at the foot of his bed. It reached out to him with tentacles that seemed to writhe and squirm, and he felt himself being pulled towards the creature, unable to resist its pull. The creature's tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him closer and closer to its gaping maw. Just as he thought it was all over, he woke up, covered in sweat and trembling with fear. He realized that it was just a dream, but the feeling of the creature's tendrils on his skin was all too real. He knew that it was just a matter of time before the creature would come for him in reality. John's mind and body started to deteriorate as the creature's influence grew stronger. He became more and more obsessed with the tome and the secrets it held, unable to resist its pull. He spent his days locked in the basement, poring over the pages, and his nights plagued by nightmares. The creature's influence spread beyond the house, and strange things began to happen in the town. People started to disappear, and strange creatures were sighted lurking in the shadows. It was as if the creature was preparing for something big. In the end, the creature claimed John as its own, dragging him into the depths of the abyss, never to be seen again. The house was abandoned, and no one dared to enter it again. But it is said that on quiet nights, when the moon is full, you can still hear the whispers coming from the house, and the screams of the creature's victims. The townspeople avoided the area, knowing that the creature still lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next victim to come home. John's descent into madness and the unleashing of the unspeakable horror upon the town will forever be a cautionary tale of the dangers of delving into forbidden knowledge and the consequences of disturbing the eldritch abode. We hope you enjoyed our journey into the world of horror. We strive to bring you the best in horror entertainment, and we appreciate your support. Remember to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of terror. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in our next story.